Welcome everyone to the September 24th, 2020 COVID-19 clinical care rounds. These are the emergency department rounds, a resident's perspective on ED patient care and clinical operations. My name is Richard Hunt. I'm an emergency physician who serves as senior medical, serves as senior medical advisor at the National Healthcare Preparedness Programs in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The purpose of these rounds are peer-to-peer real-time sharing of COVID-19 emergency department challenges and successes. If I'm preparing my emergency department for COVID-19 patients, the clinicians I want to learn from are those with the most experience. This is a voluntary public-private collaboration, thanks to the multiple professional organizations who have collaborated. They are not intended to be redundant or replace any organization's initiatives. These ECHO rounds are focused on healthcare providers sharing their successes and challenges with other healthcare providers. Thanks to Project ECHO, Dr. Bruce Strumminger and his team for the peer-to-peer learning platform we use for these rounds. Given the rapid evolution in our approach to the management of COVID-19, next week, instead of our usual schedule, we will have only one COVID-19 clinical rounds session. That will be a combined special session for critical care, emergency department, and EMS. An update on remdesivir and dexamethasone on Thursday, October 1st at US noon Eastern Time. Participants from critical care, the emergency department, and EMS rounds will receive the announcement and registration information. Once again, next week's usual round schedule will be replaced by a single combined special session, an update on remdesivir and dexamethasone on Thursday, October 1st at US noon Eastern Time. Please look for that announcement and registration information. I anticipate that after next week's single special session, we'll return to the usual schedule of Monday EMS, Tuesday critical care, and Thursday ED, all noon US Eastern Time. Thanks to NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center, for their support with these rounds. These ECHO clinical rounds and NETEC's webinars are complementary to each other. Thanks to the American College of Emergency Physicians, the Emergency Nurses Association, and the American Association of Emergency Nurse Practitioners in their support of these rounds. I'd now like to turn this over to Dr. Bruce Strumminger from Project ECHO.
Great, thank you, Rick, and thanks to all our participants for joining today, and our guest speaker and our expert panel. I'm just going to review a few housekeeping and logistic issues. We love your questions, so please include both questions and comments in the Q&A function. It's in the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. If you've got any technical or logistic questions or issues, go ahead and mention those in the chat function. We'll be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat to see if people need help, etc. Also, Rick will be asking a crowdsourcing question in a few minutes, and please put your responses in the chat. This session is being recorded, and your attendance is consent to be recorded, so thank you for that. The recording will be shared through our website, and we'll share a link to that. We've got the recordings for the past 70, nearly 75 sessions starting in March, and all the PowerPoints can be found on that website. Also, we are offering CME and continuing professional development credits. That's through the University of New Mexico, where Project ECHO is based. We will share a link to the CME survey about 15 minutes before the end of today's program. It should also be in the announcement that went out this morning, and you've got 48 hours to complete the survey, and you'll get an instant electronic continuing education certificate. We really value your feedback, so please take a few minutes and share that with us. Just as a reminder, these sessions are focused on improving patient care and health systems and supporting clinicians. Please keep them apolitical and non-commercial. Thank you for that. And also just want to remind everyone about data use. We take data stewardship very seriously, and the data you share with us, some of it is shared with Rick and Asper. It's all de-identified. So just want to ensure everyone, though, that we are taking care of your data carefully. NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center, is a partner in these clinical rounds. And I just want to remind people they have a complimentary webinar series tomorrow. They have a webinar on the current state of the pandemic. And a week from this week, on Friday, they'll be doing a webinar on PPE compliance and fatigue in first responders. Their site also has an archive of all the webinars that they've conducted over the past 6 months and a lot of great resources. So we encourage you to check that out. And with that, I now want to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Rosha McCoy with the AAMC, to give us an update on the AAMC Clinical Guidance Repository. Rosha.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm very privileged to join you from the Association of American Medical Colleges and our partnership with ASPR. We really value that. We continue to update the Coronavirus Clinical Guidance Repository. As Dr. Hunt said, there's ongoing changes in guidance around remdesivir, convalescent plasma, different organizations with different inputs. So this is a guidance repository. We have alignment summaries where we show where there's alignment between guidance. We still are getting a fair amount of traffic into this space, so we hope it's useful for clinicians. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rosha. And Rick, back to you.
Thanks. Today's rounds are special. We've talked about healthcare provider learners in many different ways over the past. We've done over 70 rounds so far, and there have been many comments made, many things in the chat, QA around our learners who are critical for the now and future. And toward that, the crowdsource question is specific to our healthcare learners. What action or actions have your organization taken to support healthcare learners during the pandemic? It'd be really helpful if you could share what your organization has done in support of our learners. They're our present and future, so yeah, let's hear from you. I want to thank all our panelists for joining. I'm going to do it a little bit different this time, maybe to save a little bit of time for our extraordinary here during the rounds. And when we do get to the discussion, if you could introduce yourselves individually before you make your comment or question, that'd be great. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. It's a real privilege to have our speaker today. I'm sure when I sent that email, it's like, where is this coming from? And that's okay. Our speaker today is Dr. Hannah Hughes, Chief Resident in Emergency Medicine at the University of Cincinnati and President of the Emergency Medicine Residents Association. Hannah, please, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Let's hope I don't have a Zoom fail, right? It's like the classic these days. If you don't have one Zoom fail, you're not doing it right. So,
that right.
Let's see what we got here. All right, checking everybody can see my screen. Excellent. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address all of you, particularly providing the EM resident perspective in all of this. It's certainly been a different year of training than any of us ever anticipated. I thought today, rather than sort of share with you the nuances of what's going on in resident education, that we could save that for the Q&A, and then I would just share with you a a story of a shift of what it's like to be an EM resident today. So here's where mine begins. Maybe. There we go. All right. It's night 6 of 6. I've already had 51 clinical hours in the books. And I'm walking into shift and I'm thinking about all of the extra things that I have to do as an EM resident outside of my clinical responsibilities. The grand rounds lecture I'm giving in a couple of weeks, the next month's resident shift schedule that I still have to work on, and the hundreds of emails from medical students who have questions about the upcoming residency application cycle. I enter the emergency department, and on the door, there's a sign that says, "Do not enter," in big capital letters. Underneath, only clinicians treating ED patients permitted past this point. It serves as a reminder that everyone, patients and hospital staff alike, is doing everything they can to avoid the place that I've spent the most time in the last week. As I walk in, it is eerily quiet. There is no one in the lobby and no one in the shock resuscitation unit, or what we belovedly call the SHREW. And I'm sure if anybody spent any time in a level 1 academic county center, you know that having an empty lobby is a very unusual thing. That's okay. I prepare myself for the battle that's yet to come by putting on my N95, my surgical mask, my face shield. As I prepare to take sign out from my colleague, the telemetry phone rings. So I answer. University Hospital, this is MD 2104, go ahead with report. I can hear the angst in the paramedic's voice as she tells me about her patient and multiple others that are coming. I use the overhead system to page out a trauma stat, multiple GSW victims, all arriving within 5 minutes. Instantaneously, the SHREW goes from 0 to 6 people. What's it like to be an emergency medicine resident in the era of COVID, particularly in a location that is not a hotspot? Well, crime is up, with more penetrating trauma than I've ever seen before. Accidental overdoses are up, with more ED buprenorphine prescriptions than I've ever prescribed before. And suicide attempts are up, as patients battle their mental health illnesses, all in the setting of unemployment, food scarcity, and even homelessness. Now, of those 6 patients that come in, 2 go directly to the operating room, another 2 go to the CT scanners located in the ED, and 1 goes swiftly to the pod because he's not in critical condition. But for the final patient, I call time of death, after we give multiple units of blood product, intubate the patient, and perform an ED thoracotomy. The social worker finds me. She hands me over a purple Post-it note with the phone number of the patient's mother. As I brace myself to call her and deliver the worst news she will ever hear, all by telephone, I think COVID has taken this too. The empathy that I was once able to deliver to patients by holding their loved ones' hands and looking them in the face as I deliver the worst news of their life. Her sobs were unforgettable. No sooner do I hang up the phone with that patient's mother, the EMS calls me not once, but twice for 2 other patients that have sustained cardiac arrest in the field and did not have return of spontaneous circulation. The death toll of my shift rises to 3, and I'm only an hour in. I wonder, were those patients having chest pain? Did they not want to come to the emergency department because they were fearful of what would happen? Were their deaths preventable? I throw away the thought, not because it's not important to understand the unintended implications of stay-at-home orders, but because I now have 9 stable patients waiting in the pod to see me, with chief complaints from abdominal pain to dizziness to frequent falls. As I'm catching up on documentation, which we all, of course, love, I look over to the charge nurse, and he's trying to wake up a patient on EMS's gurney, but the patient won't respond. So back to the SHREW I go. That patient had ingested over 200 of their antihypertensive medications in addition to benzodiazepines, all within 30 minutes of arrival. We move swiftly to intubate the patient, and I throw a gastric lavage tube down, something that I've never done before, And as I'm literally pumping his stomach, I think of how archaic it is to do so, how rarely indicated this procedure is. By the time we're done with him, we throw the kitchen sink. He's on 3 pressors, high-dose insulin and glucose and methylene blue. And off to the MICU he goes. In 8 hours, I saw 32 patients and called time of death on 8, 4 in the field and 4 in the ED. Now, none of the patients that day had COVID, but COVID impacted every single one of us, from the sweaty mask that I took off at the end of my shift, to the socioeconomic factors, mental health implications, and health-seeking behaviors it had in my patients. I walk out that day defeated by the loss that I have seen as an early EM resident. I go home to my husband, another fellow resident, as we decompress our day. I get ready to start it all over again 2 days later. Now, I never imagined training in the middle of a pandemic, but I did sign up to be available 24/7, 365, regardless of the patient's age, gender, race, orientation, citizenship status, even their ability to pay. I did not sign up to be on the front lines of COVID-19. But I am honored to return each day and put on my armor, because there is no greater honor in life than stepping up during a time of need. I am an emergency medicine resident. So I want to thank all of the EM residents in the country right now, most of which are represented here from my program and from EMRA, because this is my family, right? EM residents have gone through a very difficult time as our training has changed literally over the course of months. But we wouldn't be able to do it if it weren't for each other and for the team that we are a part of. So with that, we can talk about all sorts of things that have changed from an EM resident's perspective, whether it's the elective time that I no longer have, or the volunteer shifts that I picked up, or everything in between. But I want to thank all of the EM residents out there and everybody that is taking the time to teach us during this time when it seems like there's little time for anything else. So with that, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and finish sharing my screens and we can move on to Q&A.
Hannah, first, I just want to say you represent your fellow emergency medicine residents exceedingly well. You really do. Pretty clear why you are president of the association. Thanks for the presentation. And it's interesting when I think back to the rounds that we've done. We've done some, for example, not just COVID, but COVID and wildfires, COVID and hurricanes, COVID and protests. Actually, there's interest in doing another one on protests. You've described, you're not a hotspot, yet that extraordinary impact. And I guess, reflecting on that a little bit, and by the way, I hated nothing more than that 6th night shift, honest to goodness. Yeah, thanks for doing those. If you could, we're in the fog of war, absolutely, still are. If you could think kind of far forward, a couple of years from now, what do you think, for you personally as an emergency physician attending somewhere, how this is going to impact, 2 years from now? How is it going to influence your work and life a couple of years from now? I know that's it's sort of like doing crystal ball hocus pocus, but I actually think it's important to start thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my generation of residents and even medical students have really seen COVID as an opportunity to realize what's important in life, and really taking the time to realize that taking care of patients is such an honor, and something that we wouldn't ever want to take for granted. But as patients, we've become those, right? We have residents that have gotten sick with COVID, residents' parents who have been lost because of COVID, several in my program alone. And so I think what will happen in this generation of EM residents is we're going to realize what truly matters. And work is incredibly important and the honor that we get to have, but also that means more time with family and having kids during residency and making that acceptable. Things like that, I think, are going to become more and more important as we use the word wellness, maybe even as a catch-all phrase. And I mean it more than that, right? That this is the life that we're choosing to build. And the exciting thing is that COVID hasn't strayed anybody away from wanting to become an EM resident. We have more med students this year that are members of EMRA than ever before. Over 5,000 med students that want to become emergency medicine residents. So I think COVID has been this beautiful thing where it's shown how amazing it is to be the front lines of the healthcare system, the front lines to the hospital, while also highlighting the fact that we are humans. We are all human and all capable of being that patient with COVID. So I think it's been a rewarding experience.
Yeah, it certainly has, with like laser focus, helped us define what's important, that's for sure. One more question. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for their questions and comments. So, you know, as you mentioned, the vast numbers of medical students that you have associated with EMRA at this juncture, but from your fellow residents, and like I cannot imagine your inbox. Sandy, you and she can compare inbox volume, I think, probably. But I'm curious as to like, if like, and I'm talking about this month, not early in the pandemic, but this month. If you could kind of like describe like a couple of themes, the big themes that you're hearing from your fellow residents in emergency medicine, what are those? I mean, what is it that people are like, is it like, I'm so beyond this, or is it like, okay, you know, I'm just, what is it that you're hearing from residents?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're in September, right? So it's prime time for recruitment, both in recruiting to our residencies, but also recruiting to our first jobs. So the biggest thing I think on resident, especially senior residents' minds right now is the job market and how COVID has had an impact on that. You know, not necessarily in the positive way, right? It's almost an oxymoron that you would think that a pandemic that has impacted our country, that has led to an increased need of emergency care, would make the job market easier, but it hasn't. And I think most residents right now are fearful of what that job market looks like. And then also, how do we transition medical education to a virtual platform? You know, we've been kind of hobbling along for months and months doing things like this for grand rounds and stuff, but what does that look like when you're interviewing candidates for your program? How do you really tell if someone's going to fit into your residency? So I think we're finally at the point where we're realizing that this is much longer than anybody ever anticipated, and we need to adapt. But that's the beautiful thing. Our specialty is primed to be experts at adaptation, right? That's what we do every day on shift, is take very little information and make big decisions and pivot, 100 times a day. So I think the most part, residents are feeling a little scared, but mostly optimistic about what it means for our future and how we get to be a part of that innovation and change.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna turn it over to our panelists, and if you could raise your hand like usual, and let's see what Sandy, yeah.
Of course I have to talk. So, you know, that was an amazing presentation, Hannah. And I'm going to suggest to you that you find some way to tape that and put that in your memoirs. One of the things I've been doing since I can't travel or even go to the grocery store is digging through my parents' and my in-laws' pictures and letters, etc. And I am encouraging everyone that listens to this, regardless of what you're doing, to write down what you have done during this pandemic. Okay, maybe it's just that you did a couple of extra shifts, or what those shifts were like, or what it was like to transport patients with masks and gloves. But this is going to be studied by our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And if I find amazement, I found a letter from my grandmother during the 1918 flu epidemic. And that was an amazing letter. And she didn't do anything except try to shop for clothes. I can't imagine if I actually have any heirs, because my daughter hasn't had children. I can't imagine what it would be like for my great grandchildren or my great grandnieces or nephews to see what I did during this. And again, it doesn't need to be something great. It's just what it was like to go through this. So thank you for that presentation. I agree with you. Emergency medicine is like become the hottest specialty ever, just like ID did during HIV, except that we're much more interesting. So thank you. No question, but just thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sandy. Yeah. Remember during Ebola, I was doing 16, 20-hour days. And I remember I always, like, no matter what, went to the day one diary and put at least a few lines down. And I got to tell you, you know, that next 100-year pandemic, for all of us, if we don't like help those people the next time around, I think we've failed pretty miserably. So no, great comments, Sandy. And Bruce, these are all archived, and we actually not just archived, but I've had some thoughts about making sure these clinical rounds, and this is our 74th, I believe, end up in some archive. So the evolution of this disease gets recorded in an additional way. So Hannah, yeah, it's going to be there. So Harry.
Yeah, Hannah, thank you for that presentation first. One question kind of in two parts. You mentioned difficulty and specialty, subspecialty rotation. So I'm interested in your view of how you believe that will affect residents of your generation. But the second half of that, just over a week ago, we had Ann Zink on and gave a wonderful presentation and made the point that probably public health is a mission that we need to be more involved in. So do you think residents of this generation and EMRA will drive change in how we structure our residencies in emergency medicine and exactly what we focus on as specialties and subspecialties that we train with during our residency?
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. I think the first question about what sort of subspecialty experience we're lacking now in the era of COVID is an important one. As a chief resident, I've had to change the schedule a number of times to accommodate the fact that pediatric anesthesia is the rotation where most emergency medicine residents get pediatric intubations across the country. But we aren't the only learners there, and there's quite a few people where that's where they get their first pediatric tubes. And so I think that presents a challenge, one in that the ACGME still has a certain level of requirement that you have to hit. And so we're going to have to probably adapt to where the risk benefit of being exposed to additional intubations to be able to get that experience at some point is going to tilt more towards benefit. Maybe not right now, but the longer this goes on, you know, we have half of a intern class that hasn't had enough pediatric tubes. And my first pediatric intubation was on the helicopter in the middle of nowhere for a 5-year-old pediatric arrest. And I would hate to have that been my first intubation on a child. So at some point, we're going to have to pivot a little bit and acknowledge that the education can't be foregone if COVID still exists. I think the second question is actually super relevant, right? And I think the generation of med students that are really enamored with emergency medicine right now is the generation that realizes our role within public health and healthcare access, just because of the nature of what we do and EMTALA. So yeah, I think that you're going to start to see more social emergency medicine fellowships exist in the country as they try to combat sort of the implications that patients face and the way that impacts our training, right? It is really, I think, really tough to take care of patients if you don't have resources. And early generations of EM trainees are talking a lot about burnout, but burnout is coming from not an individual component, but a systems component. And who better to change the system than emergency medicine? So I think you're going to see more and more leaders really aiming to include the specialty in those discussions and follow in the footsteps of people like you as the panelists on this call who have done extraordinary things beyond your call as an EM physician or what have you.
Thanks, Hannah. Rosha had her hand up, and then I see Carol's, okay? So Rosha, then Carol, Amanda, Ann. Ann, I know you're not on video, but if you do have a question, just like oh, there she is. Yeah, I was gonna tell you just go off mute, but this is even better. Okay, okay, it was Rosha, then Carol. All right, Rosha.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm interested to hear from you, and I know you can't represent everyone, but you did such a great job of thinking about wellness a little bit, and what is important in life, right? So as we think about residency programs and even programs for practicing physicians in terms of preventing burnout and wellness, what works for folks? What is helpful? Because it seems as though a lot of what we offer aren't sometimes taken, people don't take advantage of it, or they're nervous to, or whatever. So can you give us a sense of what do you think is actually helpful?
Yeah, gosh, Rich, if I had the answer to that, I think I would be no longer needing to practice emergency medicine, right? This is something that's facing our specialty and other specialties in a way that we are going to have to fix. And I don't have a clear solution other than I agree with you that the resources that are provided are sometimes not taken advantage of, particularly for mental health seeking. And it perhaps should be reverted. There's still a huge stigma, obviously, behind that, with one of the biggest fears as being able to be discovered and not being able to get licensed by that. And so I think that really we should maybe take the approach that, some other some other workforces have taken, where mental health seeking is a requirement to be a part of the job, right? We are one of the few specialties that sees death every day, and we don't talk about it as much as we should be talking about it, right? Particularly in the era of COVID. So I think that if we change the dialogue to make something the norm rather than an option, then it'll start to decrease that stigma. And obviously the whole licensing piece is going to have to be taken under consideration.
Yeah, before I go to Carol, you said something that really, I just want to reinforce that, Hannah, you just said about, we really should be talking about this. And Roshi, you're asking about the wellness and wellness in medicine, we've talked about it and kind of like reinforced it for like decades now. And it's not clear to me that it's working for us right now. That's a personal observation. But Hannah, you said like we should be talking about it. And one of the things I think is an extraordinary challenge. Clinicians, I hate to say it, but I think we're a little bit different in that we feel we have the coping skills for anything. You talk about your shift, you think about that. So we can do this. And I think our lack of wanting to talk about it, many just shut down. I mean, I can remember after the death of, I've talked about this on Rails before, death of a child of one of our residents. People just like totally shut down and said, I don't want to talk about this. And so it's a huge challenge that quite frankly will kill some of us. And Rose, I appreciate you bringing it up because I think this is, and Hannah, you really put a nice fine point on it. The wellness thing, I just don't think we're there at all. And I think Sandy, you have been like pioneering the heck out of like, what are we going to do about this? You're always on message, not just on message, but you're trying the new things. We pivoted to the buddy system concept, seeing if that's going to work for us and so forth. But we just got to keep on this. I mean, we really do. Ignoring it is going to kill more people. It just will. Carol. I think it was Carol next. Yeah, Carol. Sorry, I went on. Sorry.
No, this is a great presentation. And for those in the allied healthcare fields, it's really difficult to get that hands-on education because, as a resident, you're there, but you're competing against, like you said, the pediatricians that want to get intubations and now, EMS and nursing. The one question I do want to ask you, having gone through, gosh, my book of Harrison's Internal Medicine is the last copy that doesn't even mention HIV. So, you know, we went through that, but unlike HIV and Ebola and some of these other things, COVID has had such a huge economic impact on hospitals. And I'm wondering how the residents in your class feel about the challenge of going into a job market where hospitals are laying off and furloughing emergency physicians. You know, the job market is a lot tighter. And in addition to those conversations within your own class, I'm wondering what your interns are feeling now, knowing that, you know, it may not bounce back by the time they graduate. And, you know, the student loans and things like that are still there, which kind of adds to the stress of the whole situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's unfortunately one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face within the next few years as the next generation of EM physicians. And it's tough to talk about money in a way that doesn't seem like it's the inappropriate time. And so I think that it's really about sort of maximizing opportunity. I will say that having the email of EMRA president and you know 16,000 plus members means that I was the one that got emailed by about 30 or so people back in May. These were graduating residents who had gone through the process of getting a job like everybody does and had solidified their contract back in October of 2020. And by May, their employers had used their 30-day all-cause clause to kill the contracts. And so you have, you know, graduating EM residents that thought that they had jobs and bought homes in areas and started to plan their life around that are unemployed. And that's a scary thing to think about. Now, is that transient? Probably. Most of those people were able to get placed in other places. But I think that that's just a signal of the beginning. And we're seeing that with, you know, the number of openings that are posted to job market opportunities are lower than they've ever been before. And so it's going to be a tough time. I certainly don't represent all EM residents when I say that I think that's probably the biggest thing that learners should be paying attention to right now is the job market. But interns, I think, have, you know, 2 to 3 years, depending on where they are, to sort of understand what that means for them. And really, I think what we'll see is not a decrease in the number of people that enter the specialty, but a number of people that are fellowship trained. Sort of like when teachers go through recessions and get more education during that time, I think the same will happen for EM residents. There'll be more fellowship-driven applicants in the next couple of years would be my suspicion. So, but that's okay because we all need a niche, right? Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Hannah, let's see. I think Dave had his hand up, and then Ann, if you got any comments or questions afterwards, and then we'll do the polls. All right. Okay. So Dave.
Yeah. First, Hannah, this was just an awesome presentation, and as a UC grad and former faculty member there, I'm very proud. So really appreciate that. I guess one of the things that we've noticed, of course, is that, you know, you can't travel. Everybody used to do away rotations and things. And I'm just wondering what your sense is, how that's going to affect medical students making decisions about residencies and even about the specialty. Do you think that there's going to be a change, maybe people who get into emergency medicine residencies and find it's not what they thought it was going to be, or get into places that they really don't have a good fit? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, Dave, thank you for that. You know, when I signed up to be EMRA president, or I should say when I ran for the election, I obviously never anticipated COVID being a thing. And so it was halfway through my president year when this happened, and then everything pivoted, right? 90% of what EMRA has done has been surrounding medical students entering the specialty. Because so much has changed in that if you can't travel and you can't do away rotations, and you can't interview anywhere, how do you pick a location to practice? And I'll say it as a native Californian, I would have never ended up in Cincinnati had I not been out here. And I came twice. It took me a second look to commit to Ohio. So I think it's going to impact where students are comfortable going in ways that we probably won't be able to fully anticipate. But the beautiful thing is that so many organizations, all of emergency medicine has stepped up to be together in all of this. And every EM organization in the country has been there to support medical students entering the specialty. And I'll give you an example. I was on vacation and I got a call from the ACEP president, Bill Jaquist, which rarely happens, I'll mind you. And he said, you know, Hannah, I heard that this HBCU, the historically Black college, doesn't have access to rotations, and I'm really concerned. How are they going to know if they like the specialty if we can't get them away rotations? So the fact that the president of ACEP has it on his radar that we need to make sure that the next generation of our specialty has access and equity means I think that we'll be in good hands. So it's going to be different, but I think in everything, we're doing everything we can to make sure that the process remains equitable.
Thanks, Hannah. Ann, any question, comment before I go to polls?
Yeah, no, I do. Hannah, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks for all your advocacy and work. You know, there's many different parts of what you were saying that kind of fall into one single theme for me. And I don't know if we totally have a market issue as if we have an uneven market issue. And so I work in a really rural place, and many of our rural communities cannot get good emergency physicians out there. But just as you mentioned, it's hard to, envision yourself in Cincinnati until you were out there a few times. I think it's really hard for residents to envision themselves working in a rural place until they actually go there and see it and experience it. And I hear what you're saying about needing those pediatric intubations. And I remember on my second day as an attending, criking a patient, and the surgeon handing me the scalpel and saying, I haven't ever done this, it's all your turn, and realizing that I was really on my own as an attending. But there's amazing work that can happen in rural communities, and I think that we really owe it to all keeping the house of medicine open across the state. So how do we do that? How do we get residents more interested in rural healthcare and being able to see these and make sure that they've got the skills like the pediatric intubations that you mentioned that can really only happen at smaller places? Where are you seeing that trend, and what are your suggestions and thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is not a market issue, it's an uneven market, and that is so true of so many specialties. So I think that one of the things that has come up a number of times is how do we need to get residents, like you said, out there to rural communities. Just like we have residents that do global health rotations, getting them to rural communities could be an elective in and of itself. But there's a couple of logistical barriers to that, for which EMRA and ACEP have been doing some advocacy work on, basically to try to make it to where you can still get paid as a resident to go out to a rural area that's not associated with your hospital, and that you have the appropriate supervision, since most rural hospitals still are staffed with family docs that have been doing this for amazing, 100 years and are excellent at what they do, but doesn't quite meet ACGME guidelines of what it means to supervise an EM resident. So I think that there's a couple of logistical barriers that we need to overcome, and then just provide the opportunity. If there was a rural health elective at my program, I'd absolutely do it, because some of the coolest things that we get to do in emergency medicine are actually in the middle of nowhere. And I've seen that firsthand on a helicopter and landing. I didn't even know what a bean field looked like, and so when I landed there, this is the crux of emergency medicine, is being low resource, high acuity. So yeah, we have to fix the logistical barriers, and then I think showing residents what they're missing out on will change the job market significantly.
That was a great conversation, and it strikes me that theme, the rural, how do you get people? It's a public health, emergency medicine, profound interface, at least in my view. I mean, how come we hadn't unlocked that one yet? So a lot of issues to deal with for sure. Let's do the polls. They're all focused on, and I use the phrase healthcare provider or healthcare learners. I couldn't come up with exactly what the right phrase was, and I'm still working on my polling capabilities, but that's what I've come up with. So Echo can put up the polling questions, and for information, as Bruce mentioned at the top, we actually don't identify individual responses like, oh, by the way, John Smith made that response. We don't do that. It's always aggregate. And yes, we share it with you and we share it with HHS as well. So maybe having a little few technical difficulties. We'll see. There we go. Okay. I mean, most of these are pretty straightforward. They're not like the 10 option ones. There's no select alls. They're pretty straightforward. Our organization trains healthcare providers. And for each of these today, there's a don't know, not applicable, I don't train healthcare providers option. So everybody ought to have the opportunity for an option to vote. All right, this was pretty straightforward. There's about 48% of you voted. We'll give it another few seconds. Gosh, I'd love to do 50. We got 40, 50. All right, we're done. All right. So 60%, okay. Said yes. All right, now we're gonna get down into like some deep dives here. All right, deeper dives for sure. This is about the number of healthcare providers compared to before the pandemic. The number of healthcare providers trained now by our organization is increased, same, decreased, don't know, or not applicable. Wow, wait till you see these. This is fascinating. 49% of you voted. Let's get at least a 50. All right, let's stop there. 52% voted. I had no idea how this was gonna pop up. And when, you know, you're talking about organizations, we have a broad cross-section of healthcare provider organizations whose the participants are from a lot of different organizations, ranging from EMS, nursing, respiratory therapists sometimes are on the call. So I didn't subdivide it down by discipline, but it was pretty fascinating to see the wide responses there. All right, next. I guess I think I'm surprised that some have actually increased at all. All right, next one. Okay, compared to before the pandemic, the number of applicants to our training programs. So this is about applicants. I saw on Twitter where one program, emergency medicine program, just got approved for their increase from 10 to 12 residents per year. And I thought to myself, I wonder if the applicant pulls out that. I mean, I just don't know. 57% of you voted. That's great. Another 5 seconds, we'll stop. All right, 59% voted. Thank you. Increased 11%. Same 18%. Decreased 5%. And then the rest don't know, not applicable. Interesting. Increased 11% increased and 5% decreased. Fascinating. Okay, next. And there is a phenomenal amount of discussion, energy around healthcare workforce at HHS for sure, and has been informed by responses to previous polls for sure. Since the pandemic, the content and delivery of our organization's training program is better, same, worse. Excuse me. let's stop there. 57% of you voted. Wow. 20% said that's the most frequent response out of the better, same, worse. Better, 20%. How about that? I mean, yeah, they're low numbers, but still, people are in the real world when they respond to these. So how about that? All right, thank you. All right, next one. And we're having a few technical like internet stability things going on. So be patient with us while we try to get the next ones up. One or more healthcare provider learners in our organization have acquired COVID. Boy, people are jumping on this one fast. And thanks for people participating. It really, I mean, when people see the results, I see the results, you see the results, and a lot of you voted it. It's obviously more meaningful. And no, I'm not a statistician. Okay, let's stop there. %28 said yes, 26% said no. It's fascinating though that there's 21% didn't know whether or not learners had acquired COVID-19. I mean, it brings up the whole issue of like privacy and the HIPAA thing, and but yeah, I hadn't thought that much about that before. Okay, next. All right, the next three questions are related to themes that we have talked about on every rounds for months now, but also we brought this up during these rounds too: mental health, fatigue, and complacency. This one is mental health. So since August, just the past month and a half or so, in general, the mental health of our healthcare provider learners, so it's the learners, seems to be better, same, worse, don't know, not applicable, because you don't provide healthcare education. Another 5 seconds. 55% of you voted. Thank you. 56. All right, let's stop there. And the results, 7% said better, 17% said same, 26% said worse. And that tracks, it tracks pretty closely with what we've seen in the polling results for EMS and critical care and emergency department rounds when we were talking about providers that weren't learners. It tracks pretty similarly. Thank you. Next. This one's about fatigue. So same question with the word fatigue. I think there's just 2 more polling questions after this. And then what I'll do is go to each of our panelists for any quick comments, final questions they might have. And then Hannah, you get the last word. All right, let's stop there. 55% of you voted. I'm so proud of our participants. You know, when we started the polling, we were getting like 20% respondents. Now, like everybody just jumps on. It's great. All right, so fatigue, less 8%, same 12%, more 40%. Again, that tracks similarly to the other polls we've done on this. It's really good to see that a kind of the lens of this being through learners, though, really is. All right, thank you. Next. This is complacency. And it was, as you respond to this, it's the same question, just with the word complacency. Was interesting, we, when these results were shared and then sort of like modified in bullet form and so forth, so on at HHS, somebody wanted to replace the word complacency with another word. And I said, no, it's the clinicians you need to listen to and the words they use, not something else. As Bruce emailed me, he said, yeah, words matter. And for this one, words really do matter. All right, 55% of you voted. Let's stop there, and then we'll go to the last question. Let's see the results. Again, tracking similarly to the responses for emergency department, critical care, and EMS rounds. More 31%. All right, thank you very much. The last question. Now, this is like not like near term, but 2022. And it's an opinion. So there's no not applicable. Everybody's got to have an opinion. All right. So I believe that in 2022, the number of applicants to healthcare provider training programs will increase, stay the same, or decrease. All right, let's stop there. Actually, I'm hoping that this is like ending the polling on a note of optimism. Like, look at those results. 57% said increase, 22% said stay the same, and 22% said decrease. And I mean, my belief is in 2022, we're going to need more healthcare providers than ever. Yeah, for the consequences of what's happened over the past year, or since the pandemic, I should say. Thanks, everyone. It was great see all the responses from every one of you, and really is gratifying. And Echo, I know, you know, the internet wasn't helpful for this one for you, and thanks for like gutting it through and getting those polls up. All right, if we can go back to the screen and Hollywood Squares for each of you. Let's go around the Hollywood Squares and any final comments before we close out. Anne?
Great, yeah, thank you. And I do have to run. I just wanted to say thank you for the awesome presentation, Hannah. And I'm really excited to see all the chat in the chat box and systems changes. This is a systems issue to figure out how we connect these pieces, and excited to build on that conversation. So appreciate your time.
Thanks. Harry? Thanks, Anne. Thanks for joining.
I just wanted to say, Hannah, I hope you'll continue to work with IMRA together with ACEP and ACGME to drive change in our programs relative to what we've seen over this last 9 months and what we're going to continue to see over this next couple of years. I think it may be a catalyst to actually make some improvements in our training. So I'm happy to see you here and welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Dave?
Yeah, Rick, last week and this week you had residents presenting, and I just want to say it gives me hope that in my old age, there'll be somebody to take good care of me.
Yeah, ditto that. Yeah, talk about heroes. Sandy.
Yeah, again, Hannah, that was absolutely marvelous. I think one of the points that you brought up around the residents and attendings delaying care for mental health issues is something we need to continue to address. I know that the ACEP and EMRA and a lot of other organizations signed on asking the government to, or asking, excuse me, state medical boards to lift this. But this is something that Rick, we probably need to circle back on again. Because if this is even a perceived barrier, I mean, who are we as physicians if we think somehow we don't need this help and everyone else in the whole world does? So I think this is something we've got to work on.
Sandy, just big yes. Of the things that I mean, you've been on almost as many of these as I have, and the mental health piece, the complacency, the fatigue, I mean, it's going to kill us, literally. And I think many have just don't want to talk about it. And that, I'm not sure you can figure out the coping mechanisms if they're not working without talking about it. So I got to figure this out. And yeah, I'm going to need your help, and may enlist some of the other, and no, these rounds won't solve it alone, but it certainly doesn't hurt the dialogue for sure. So yeah.
I think if I could just comment.
Yeah, go.
I've probably lost almost as many friends to suicide as I have to disease. And Rick and I were talking about a friend of ours that passed away this past week, not from suicide. But I think the toll of suicide and just the toll on the people who don't commit suicide, but just live with this is immense, and will continue to be immense until we figure a way out of it. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah. Carol?
Oh, first of all, Dave, I'm the old one in the bunch. We're from Cincinnati, so you're just a baby in Pampers. Almost out of Pampers. Hannah, this is fantastic. It really, to me, challenges bring opportunities, and I would advise to inform your members of your organization that these are great opportunities for us, not only to be pioneers, but to realize that pandemics, whether it's pandemic or a terrorist event or whatever, it's going to require emergency physicians. We are the experts for emergency preparedness. We're on the front lines. And 20 years ago, you never saw an emergency physician sitting at a Homeland Security meeting or a public health meeting. And now we've got seats at the table. We need to continue demanding that, because we are one of the pillars that if we're not there, the whole building will fall down. We are the front lines, and we're proud to do it. I'm how many decades into my career, and I'm still excited about it, and still love my helicopter days, because you learn so much. And just keep that in mind. We've got telemedicine, we've got political opportunities, policy making opportunities, where we can make a pathway to nirvana. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Sounds like a song or a good group. Okay.
Yes.
Bruce, anything before we close out and I hand this over to Hannah?
Just thank you, Hannah. We did record your story. I love the story approach you took, and thanks for inspiring so many of your emergency medicine resident colleagues, as well as everybody here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Let's see, Hannah, last word?
Yeah, well, thank you so much again for the opportunity to spend some time with all of you. I would like to say one thing, and that's if you are a teacher of any learner, whether they're a resident or not, just remember that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. And as learners, we really need to see the people that we admire and want to emulate have those characteristics of sharing their stories, because I think within stories we can really learn how to fix systems issues. So thank you in advance for all of your vulnerability and for shaping the next generation of EM physicians.
Hannah, I mentioned it before, but you really have done your fellow emergency medicine residents proud with this today, really, genuinely. And this is going to sound really paternalistic, attending kind of like thing, but the one thing, a personal ask for you, don't get burned out. I mean, leaders, particularly at this moment in history, are so vulnerable to the burnout, I can't tell you. And so be gentle with yourself, okay? And with that, thanks to our participants, to our panelists always, and Hannah, our regards to all your fellow residents. And I think you have a group of people here who are more than willing to help and share as needed. So thanks all. Bye. See you on the next one.